Like, look, guys, here again, I've said this to a few people, and I said this on the stream a few times. The real red pill on climate change, okay, is that, okay, the biggest factor being CO2. Obviously, there's a number of things we're putting in the atmosphere, right, that we probably should cut it out. But the big problem that's cited is we're putting all this CO2 in the atmosphere and also methane, but the methane's easier to chill out on. And people on the far left, especially like Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg and all these people are like, oh my God, we're all going to die, right? So they obviously think it's very serious. But the thing is, we know how to solve that problem. We know how to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. It is not even that hard, okay? It, however, costs as much energy as we got by releasing the CO2 into the atmosphere, okay? We have to reverse that whole process. We know how to do that, okay? Because we can build nuclear reactors that provide more energy than we've ever had. And in fact, if you look at graphs from the Atomic Energy Commission in the 1950s, they expected us by today to have more than 10 times as much energy per capita as we actually have. Having more energy is a synonym for being rich. So we have chosen policies that make us poor, all right? We have chosen policies that make it hard to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. And it's people act like it's unheard of to be able to do this, and like it's not. It's just inordinately expensive, but we chose to make it expensive. All right. Now, that said, there are companies working right now to make it cheaper, and we should do that. And I think the most realistic, most viable short-term view of getting climate under control is you do some of the CO2 direct air capture and turn it back into fuels, and we still use petrofuels for a bunch of things because it's hard to substitute other forms of energy for those things. That is not an appealing view to anybody, right? Because people on the left want this to be a moral thing, that we're guilty sinners for using energy, and that's part of what they want out of it, right? And people on the right just want to react against people on the left. Nobody is being the adult in the room saying, look, let's just build some fucking nuclear reactors and get this over with. All right? Because that is politically unpopular, right? Because what happens if you make a mess with nuclear waste or something, which is true. Okay? Which is true. But if you actually believe that we were all going to die from too much CO2, you would fucking do it. So nobody actually believes this, right? Or we would be building the nuclear reactors. It doesn't take that long. Now, you don't hear any of this in the mainstream discussion because nobody in the mainstream discussion wants to actually solve problems. They just want to argue. The function, and that includes news channels and all this stuff, right? The reason the news is telling you about what people said in climate change is not to help solve the problem. It's to promote arguing about the problem, right? People who want to be famous for talking about climate change want to be famous for talking about climate change. They're not that invested in whether what they're saying is really true. They'll tell you they are, but they're not acting like it. So it's all complete horseshit from that standpoint. From the standpoint that, if we were being serious about solving the problem, the situation would look very, very different than it does today because we know how to address the problem. We have technology right now to address the problem. With substantial Manhattan Project style investments, it could get even better than it is, but it doesn't need to get that much better. You just need to build some nuclear reactors and you're done. And I don't want to fucking hear it from anyone who doesn't understand those facts or who won't entertain the idea. Because if you won't entertain the idea, then it's obviously not as much of an existential threat as is being claimed. Yeah, well, that's true. Like, so before climate, according to the models that we have, which are probably not totally inaccurate, right? Ocean acidification becomes a problem long before the temperatures are too high. Like, if most sea life dies out due to the environment being hostile, that's a big problem for us. So, like, we should address that. Someone is profiting off the problem not being solved. I mean, yes, an inordinate number of people are profiting off the problem not being solved. It is actually quite a lot like the so-called homeless crisis in San Francisco, which gets worse every year and more money gets spent on it, and it still gets worse every year. It's the same dynamic, sadly, right? If the problem went away tomorrow, this entire sector of people would be unemployed. So they're not invested in solving the problem. The people who don't want it to be solvable are very niche, are they? I mean, like, again, looking at the homeless thing, I don't think they're very niche. I think the people who don't want it to be solved are in charge of all the organizations. They won't tell you that they don't want it to be solved. In fact, they may not believe consciously that they don't want it to be solved. But if they all wanted it to be solved, it would be fucking solved, right? So they want other things more than they want to solve the problem. For example, they want to uphold some incorrect idea, some incorrect, ideological position about how you should handle homelessness. They want to uphold that more than they want to solve the problem, right? So that's just it. That's all. So you can extrapolate that to climate change, right? Certain people want the religion and sin aspect more than they want to solve the problem. Not everybody, right? But a significant number of people in significant positions. Also, what they do is make it easier to be homeless. I know, right? Yes, that is exactly the problem, right? Is that they incentivize what they're supposedly trying to solve. But like, if you really cared about solving the problem, you would notice this pattern. You would put your foot down and say, hey, we've been doing this for 10 years, this one thing, and it's actually incentivizing what we're trying to solve. Let's not do that. And the reason people don't do that is because it's rocking the boat. It's counter to accepted beliefs, etc., right? So the problem persists. So really the problem is that people don't want to solve the problem, right? That is really what it is. Does San Francisco give homeless people cash? Yes, I believe it's $800 a month, something like that. Let's see. 687. I transposed my digits. $687 a month, as well as a wide range of additional services and assistance. If that was the right page. It does feel vaguely fascistic. Well, I mean, you have to do something, right? Yeah. Like, but it's a complicated issue, right? Because the idea is like, well, it's not, like, what do? Do you commit people to mental hospitals like we used to do? It's like, well, but those were abusive. Well, you could enforce that they're not abusive, right? You could have serious punishments for people who are abusive, who are the staffs of these places. But also, there's this idea that it's more compassionate not to commit people to that, but it's not. What is happening right now is not compassionate. It's horrible. It's horrible. If you haven't ever been there and seen the scale of what's going on in San Francisco, is not a compassionate way to treat people, to just like let them be in this thing, right? Your average person wants to fix shit. No, I understand that, right? The problem with the average person is not the average person's fault, right? The problem with I agree that the average person just wants to fix the thing. The average person just wants things to be better, right? The problem is they're in an information environment that is inaccurate. It's not their fault because they're flooded by misinformation, right? But it's misinformation from official sources about what is the current situation about climate change, right? So I'm not saying it's people's fault. I am saying that it's the people's fault who are in charge of all the many organizations that are supposedly fighting this problem, and the people who, again, heads of news media and all these things. And like, the thing is, it's all of those people's problem, because it wouldn't be that hard to just start saying what I just frickin' said, because people who are familiar with the situation in technology know that we can do this, right? It's not even controversial. Like, we just know how to do this. It's not even an experiment. Like, we could build it today, right? And it's not even impractical, right? Like I said, people say like, oh my God, it's so expensive. But like, that's what people used to say about electric cars, right? They used to say, oh my God, you'll never have electric cars because there's no infrastructure. It would be horrible to build the infrastructure. And it's like, what are you talking about? So Tesla just goes and builds the infrastructure. Fuck you, the end, right? That's all we have to do is do that for CO2 capture. It's not that big of a deal. But yeah, so it's a lot of people's fault. Now, the thing is, it's not really a coincidence that all of these people happen to be misaligned. They're following their own incentives, and the incentives are to profit off the situation, not to solve the situation. It's not an accident. It's not an accident. Where would be the test grounds for nuclear reactor? What do you mean? We have in the US many nuclear reactors running currently. What do you mean the test grounds? And if you're doing direct air capture, so, if you're doing, if you're powering houses, you want the nuclear reactor to be at least kind of near the houses so that you minimize transmission losses, right? If you're doing direct air capture, if you had one reactor just powering air capture, that could be anywhere. It could be out in the middle of the, frickin' Sahara Desert, right? And you just capture a bunch of CO2 out from the Sahara Desert, and you're fine. Like, it's not that people make up problems. People make up problems. Direct air capture is super expensive. I addressed that at the very beginning of this rant. You could scrub back in the VOD and see what I have to say about that. It's expensive because we decided it's expensive, because we decided to be poor for the same reason that it seems expensive. And yes, if it's actually a dire situation, it doesn't matter how expensive it is, right? If there's a comet heading toward the Earth and we knew for sure it was going to hit us, would we be saying, oh man, it's super expensive to try to build something to blow up that comet? It's like, no, we wouldn't be fucking saying that. It's ridiculous, guys. It's ridiculous. And once you learn to spot these inconsistencies, you see them everywhere. It's like, okay, here's the official story, but like, this doesn't add up. So it's obviously not an accurate story. And that's a good skill to have. How many direct air capture plants need to be built? A lot. I actually was at a speech a month or two ago from someone who wanted to do this with solar panels instead of nuclear reactors. Because he was like, nuclear reactors are politically unfavorable. So what do we have to do if we do it with solar panels? And the answer is 5% of the land area of the Earth covered in solar panels would solve the problem. That's a fucking lot, right? And that's insane. I don't think that'll ever happen. That's a very, very hard engineering project. But look, if you really believe civilization will fall or we cover 5% of the Earth's surface in solar panels, you would do the latter. Okay? But like, okay, instead of solar panels, use nuclear reactors. There you go. Wait for fusion reactors. Fusion is going to be a ways off unless we get really, really lucky. Oh, 5% of the Earth's land area, by the way, not the entire surface, right? The land area. So the 5% figure is, the 5% figure is the following: to replace all current fossil fuel energy use with generation of petrochemicals via carbon capture with current technology. All right. So if you make some technological advancements, which some companies are attempting to do, that number goes down, right? But again, that's with solar panels. You don't need to do that if you're willing to build some nuclear reactors. It's just not an issue. Am I saying extreme cold being a result of climate change is obvious misinformation? I'm saying I have no reason to believe it or not believe it, right? I mean, the news media is saying myocarditis is caused by cold or heat or by, like, I've seen so much just bullshit that just sound, it just, I don't see a reason to necessarily believe it. Like, are you really saying a warmer average temperature leads to more extreme cold than a colder average temperature? Like, maybe, but like, I have no reason to really believe that. Yeah, that's the other thing, right? So it's not only climate change. There's this whole thing about like, oh my God, we're running out of fresh water. The future is going to be horrible because everyone's going to be at war with each other over water, which is another thing the Davos people have been saying. Just build some fucking nuclear reactors and desalinate the water. Okay? It's not that hard. Yes, desalination takes a lot of energy. Just do it. Like, what the fuck, right? If you actually think that's big of a problem, you would solve it. It's like our entire civilization is run by babies now. Like, I can't believe it. How is it reasonable to burn fossil fuels and turn around and tell other countries who are behind that they're not allowed to do what we just did? I know that's certainly an aspect. And the thing is, those countries are not going to take that as an answer, right? Like, China very clearly is going to develop, and they're the biggest country. India is probably bigger, I think, by a little bit. But India is also just going to develop. They're not going to like be like, oh, okay, we won't develop our nation because you said so. They're going to say, fuck you. Like, it's just not a choice, right? Plutonium and uranium would be really expensive. Are they? Have you looked that up? Do you know you can just filter uranium out of seawater, by the way? There's so much uranium in the ocean. It's not weapons grade, okay? Refining weapons grade, plutonium, for example, is really hard. But you don't need weapons grade plutonium to run a reactor. Do I know how much seawater we have? 11. We have 11 of seawater. Do I think it would be better if people switch jobs to work on those problems? Maybe, but it kind of works the opposite way, right? Like, there has to be incentives to work on those problems. Otherwise, even if people switch jobs or whatever, they're going to be underpowered, right? But I'm just so tired of the fucking rhetoric. It's just like, fix the problem or I don't want to hear it. Like, at least be legitimately trying to fix the problem or I don't want to hear it. Do I think a carbon trading scheme is enough to naturally incentivize private carbon capture? I mean, it's hard to say. It would have to be a lot more like stringent than the ones being discussed. And then the problem is who enforces that. Because again, if you make the price too high, the countries who don't want to do it are just going to say, fuck you. Why do we still not have a carbon tax? I mean, how would you do it? As soon as you institute, for example, I mean, I assume you mean like a carbon tax that goes into pricing in the US or some country like that. How do you accurately measure that? Because as soon as you put that into place, you've incentivized every person in the world to game it, right? So why do you expect that to come out well? And then, what does the carbon tax do? Like, what do the proceeds go toward? Solving the problem? We just discussed how people don't want to solve the problem. So, like, why? Like, it's not like the US government doesn't have a lot of money. Again, if they thought this problem was important, they would solve it, right? Like, it's not like you need an extra 10 cents on all these purchases to get money. Like, when you pay taxes back to the government on your thing, that is money the government already had that they gave you in the first place, okay? They printed the money. They don't need to take it back from you in taxes.